hit SB dot, it gives me this drop-down list of every member and every function that is available to that data object. It tells you, so you don't have to know every piece of the code and every little function that each object can do, because it'll tell you. And then it gives you this little tooltip, and it'll tell you what needs to go there, what's acceptable, and it also shows you overloads. And overloads are different versions of the same function that you can do. Like here is the same thing. Here's the append function, and I'm showing you the first one, the fourth one, and the 10th one out of 19 different overloads you can do for this. And you just click the little arrows up or down, and it tells you the different things and the different values. Like the first one, it takes a Boolean value, so true or false. The second one, it takes a character array. The third one, it takes any object. Okay, so that's a little bit about .NET. Now, Alchemy is an open source grid computing platform that is written in the .NET framework. Alchemy uses the .NET components to make it easier for you to interface your application with the grid. Now, like Globus, for instance, which is written in either Python or Java or C, the API isn't as easy to use. There's a lot of data dependent or a lot of library dependencies. So you have to install 8 different modules in order to be able to develop with the full function set in Globus. But with Alchemy, you just have to have the one install, and it gives you the SDK, which has all the libraries. And there's only, I don't know, 8 libraries or something, and those are built on .NET functions. So each library uses a native Windows component to do whatever it is that it does. And it, like I said, it makes it easier to implement strategies because you can code your applications faster, and you know that natively it's going to work the way it's supposed to. You don't have to worry about handling communications or handling data passing or things like that because it does it for you. It contains multiple libraries and applications. There's really only 2 applications that are absolutely necessary to run an Alchemy grid. There's an executor and a manager. And then a third piece is the console, which allows you to manage your grid. Like I said, there's only 2 parts. The manager handles the storage of the threads and the allocation of those threads to the executors, which actually process the threads and passes the information back to the manager, which passes it back to your application. So when you're writing your application and you're coding, your parallel code, you submit all your threads to the manager. You don't have to worry about knowing how many different nodes you have out there, what their names are, what their IP addresses are, whether they're using different usernames and passwords. You don't need to know any of that stuff. All you need to know is your credentials for your application or for your user to the manager, and then you submit threads to the manager, and the manager handles it for you. It handles the passing out to the executors and receiving that information back and passing it back to your application. Okay, the manager you load onto a public PC or server. Ours is loaded onto a server sitting on the internet down in Mississippi. And then the executors are loaded on the individual grid nodes. So this laptop has an executor on it. We have, I think, 7 or 8 nodes right now in our grid, and I'll show you those in a little bit. So one of the main things that people ask is what about my network communications? What do I have to worry about with this? One of the primary concerns is network traffic. Is my traffic going to increase? Well, yes, it's going to increase. But they're little small packets. It's a SYN-ACK transaction most of the time. If it's not accepting processes, it still sends out what it calls a heartbeat, and it pings back to the manager to let the manager know, hey, I'm still here, I'm still connected. And you can set the amount of time that it does the heartbeat. By default, it's set to 5 seconds, but you could set it to anything you want. So every 60 seconds, every 120 seconds or whatever, it can ping back and say, okay, I'm here, and then the manager will send a packet back saying, okay, I know you're here, and then that's it. So the communication, it doesn't overload. It doesn't get in the way of the other packets that are running through your network. The other thing is about authentication. Can you see the authentication credentials going over the network? With the actual executors, each executor has a username and password associated with it, just so the manager knows that it is a valid node to connect to this grid. That stuff is sent over in plain text. I know they're working on doing something with encryption with that, but it's really not that big of a deal. Because even if a user or a hacker or a cracker or whatever you want to say gets that information, they won't be able to do anything with it because all the passwords for administrative privileges are on a database on the manager. And when you try to log on to the manager with these credentials, it's not going to give you the functionality to do anything because it's role-based. Executors only have one function, and that's to execute threads. It cannot do anything else other than execute threads. So the information going across in plain text, it's not that big of a deal. If you log into the console and try to do administrative, that is encrypted. Also, any passwords that are in your application is serialized, so it just comes over as junk. They won't be able to read what it is. It's just the heartbeat pings that the executor sent to the manager require it to send its credentials with it to say that it's a valid node. So what about PC performance? Well, like I said earlier, most of the time, it'll check. Grid managers will check and make sure that you're not using your PC. Alchemy definitely does that. It will not execute threads if you are using your computer. That's built in to the operator, to the framework. It only does it when your system is idle for more than 2 minutes. And it doesn't have to flip to screensaver in order to run. If your screensaver is set to not hit off until 20 minutes, or you don't even have a screensaver at all, then it'll still, after 2 minutes of idle, it'll start accepting threads. But it'll know as soon as you hit that mouse or hit a button or whatever, it'll stop, it'll finish whatever thread it's currently processing, and then it won't accept anymore. Okay, and then what about harmful threads? What about applications that are doing something to try to compromise the individual executor system? Well, the code is executed in a sandbox, which allows it to not touch your actual system. The thread is processed within the sandbox, and like you can't tell it to go out to see and delete, whatever. It just won't do it because it doesn't allow it to get outside of the sandbox. And you can also turn that off. I don't know why you would want to, but it's in place so you don't have to worry about malicious threads coming through. So here's a couple little pie charts about network traffic increase. The manager increases a lot. The individual traffic for the manager increases a lot because it is getting information from all these different nodes, as opposed to the executors. You only gain about 25% more traffic, which now is really not that big of a deal. I mean, unless you're running 56K, you won't notice it. And if you got 56K, I don't want you on my grid anyway, because I'm not going to be able to get information back from you fast enough. So, I mean, there's a bit of a jump with the manager, but generally the manager, you would want to keep it as a dedicated machine specifically for the task of managing your grid, because you have to associate that information in a database. Here is a packet intercepted, and you can see where that red box is, how it's passing over username, password, executor. That is the actual executor username and password. That's why I just leave them at default, because not only do you know what they are when you see it, but you also know that the role in your grid is set up to where it's only executing threads. So I just left it at default because it doesn't really matter. I mean, if somebody's looking, they're going to be able to get it anyway. But you can see how the thread or how the ping or the heartbeat is set up. Up at the top, you can see that it's doing the heartbeat. It's passing the alchemy.core.imanager library. That's the .NET component that it is using to tell you what a heartbeat is. So that's why your application knows, or your manager knows what that heartbeat is, because it's using from that specific library. And then it's got some other information, the version of the core that you're running, the public license key, which is generated every time you log on to the grid, and some basic other information. And that is for statistics, because the console will allow you to get real-time statistics on your nodes. It'll tell you what architecture, hardware architecture it's running, what processor power it's got, the name, the ID, some other thing. I'll show you those in a little bit too. Okay, so to configure the manager, just install it under the default settings. There's not a whole lot to tweak and to mess with if you're just doing the regular binary and you're not messing with the actual source code of the application. Your options for storing information or storing the data, like the thread data, the executor data, user data, things like that, you have three options. You can use it either stored in memory, you can store it in a MySQL database or a SQL Server database. The problem with storing it in memory is that if your system ever goes down and comes back up, all your information is lost. So you don't have records of the executors that were running. You won't get those back until the executors reconnect. Your username and passwords all reset back to default. So memory is a good choice if you're just going to do something quick, if you don't want to have your grid up 24/7. If you're just going to write one application, do it real quick, you want to use these nodes that you have available, like from somebody else's grid or from something like that, then you can just do it in memory. But a SQL database is definitely the way to go because you can keep track of your whole history of applications that you had, threads that you had, users, nodes, everything. Our grid is run on MySQL. So you can install that directly on the same box that your manager is because that's where most of the processing comes from as far as your manager. It comes from the I/O of the database. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a dedicated machine for your manager and a dedicated machine for your SQL Server because the manager isn't really doing a whole lot as far as intensity and processing. It's just going to be sending out I/O from the database. So you might as well just keep them on the same system. You have to have, if you use a SQL database, then you have to have that installed prior to installing the manager with everything configured, with your root user configured, with any users that you want configured. If you want to run your grid on a different user in a different database, you have to have all that set up prior to installing the manager. It will not do that for you, so you have to have a little bit of knowledge on how to set that stuff up. But after it's installed, you just run the application. For the first time, it gives you a prompt. It asks you what type of database you're using, and depending on which one you choose, you put in the credentials that are necessary to connect to that database. And then once it's installed, and you just click Run on the manager, and you minimize it, and you just let it go. Okay, to manage the manager, you use the console, like I said earlier. The console is included in the Alchemy SDK. Currently, the 2.0, the .NET 2.0 framework version of the executor and the manager is out and in production, but the console is still in 1.1. There's a lot in the console, and the development team on Alchemy isn't all that huge. I think they maybe have 4 regular developers, and they all have other jobs, so it hasn't been updated yet. They're constantly doing work to the executor and the manager, but they haven't done anything really with the console because it still works. It still does what you need it to do. There's just a couple little buggy things that would be nice to get changed, and I'll talk about them in a little bit too. But you just download that or download the SDK, which you're going to need anyway in order to develop software for the grid. So, and that's when you open up the root folder of that zip file that you get. You have a bin directory and an examples directory, and your bin directory has all your libraries and everything to write a grid application, and it also has the console precompiled sitting there for you, as well as the source code for that. And then in the examples, it gives you a bunch of different examples of things little things like factoring out pi, prime numbers, fractals. There's 6 or 7 different ones. So the first thing you need to do when you manage or when you you install your console or your manager, you can't manage your manager by itself. You can't actually configure anything in your manager from the management console because it's just one little GUI window. So you need the console in order to change things. And obviously, like I said, I left the username and password for the executor and the users set to the default. The users, the only thing they're able to do is view the statistics of the grid. And if you want to lock that down, you can. I didn't care. I don't care if people go in and want to look at things because they can't do anything. And then the executors, the only thing that they can do is process threads. So if they had the console and tried to log in with your executor name, they wouldn't even be able to log in. And then the administrator is the one you need to lock down. You need to change that right away because the default is admin. So obviously you want to change that right away. So here is the first screen. When you open up the console, you just hit up in the top left-hand